Whether we're parents or educators, we all want our learners, our children, to become highly motivated, responsible, accountable members of society. That requires a high degree of intrinsic motivation. Unfortunately, our systems of education, with the emphasis on grades and performance, standardized testing, kill that intrinsic motivation because they take away the student's choice, their ownership, and their voice because they aren't doing anything real and purposeful that make a difference in their lives. Are you making that mistake? Do you want to do something different? Well, then stay tuned for the rest of this learner's mindset discussion where we explore how to counter the negative impact of the way that intrinsic motivation is being robbed from our children today. Welcome to another session of our Learner's Mindset Discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnik, and
I'm Talissa Thibodeau.
today we're going to be looking at motivation, more specifically intrinsic motivation. And we're going to lean in a little bit more and explore why do schools crush or kill or demotivate individuals? And where's this coming from? Well, this past week, I ran across an article that showed some research that schools actually will crush intrinsic motivation. And they do so because intrinsic motivation is usually related to what a student wants to do, what they're interested in, their values, their desires, their engagement. And our schools are not designed to promote that. Our schools are designed systemically to assess student knowledge, student information, and systemically, they're all about measurement and measuring whether or not a student is going to make the grade on the standardized test. So that article, as well as a couple other articles I stumbled across this week, has me thinking once again about that learner's environment, building that learner's environment that will actually stimulate and motivate that intrinsic motivation. So this is where we're going today. Any initial thoughts before we dig into this and make some other connections with some other articles I ran across?
Sure. What you're talking about hits home for me as a classroom teacher. I was always chasing after deadlines. When is the next standardized test? When is the next end of course exam? They call them EOCs. The 6 weeks test, and not only that, but how am I going to fit all this into my day? These TEKS that I have to, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, I have to fit this into my lesson plans. How do I fit all this in? It becomes just sort of a going through the motions. And when teachers kind of get to that point where they're focused on standardized tests, teaching the skills, knowledge, competencies, we lose sight of the learner's experience in a way, and growing and cultivating the environment. Kids need to be innovative and successful and excited about learning. Sometimes in 5302, I'll tell students that, and that's the first course in our program, that we've grown to educate and school kids instead of grow their passions and what's important to them and help them learn in a way that's exciting and innovating for them. Sometimes we educate kids as opposed to letting them learn, and I think we need to go down that pathway and talk a bit about that, because are we squandering that opportunity, as you say, to grow intrinsic motivation in our students but also in ourselves as teachers too? Because it seems that sometimes the information transfer model and the chasing after the tests and the deadlines is really just squashing the light out of some of our schools and kids and teachers too.
Well, I think you said something that's interesting. We educate our learners or we school them. They become schooled. They know how school works. They know how to give the teacher back what they want to pass a test. And you also said something that is interesting, but also, unfortunately, depressing in one sense, in the sense that, school is about delivering that information, delivering the content, measuring the competencies, measuring the skills, but it's not about learning. It's not about preparing the student for life. It's preparing them for the test. And systemically, your primary and secondary school teachers are so caught up in the busyness of education, the
That's it.
busyness of school, and that's really unfortunate. But they're not alone. Here's another connection. There was another article I ran into this week as well. This one, I believe, was in the Chronicle of Higher Ed that talked about the fact that professors want to use, active and dynamic learning. They want to use technology. They want to be more effective instructors, but there aren't. They still lecture. That's what they do. They traditionally lecture. Why? Well, this study revealed some new insights. Number one, they don't have enough time. There's just not enough time to learn how to do this. And the
Mhm.
second biggest reason, which I would argue is the biggest reason, is they actually don't need to. In higher ed, most people are working towards tenure promotion. And even if you aren't working in tenure promotion, since everybody else is, the priority is to, again, deliver the content, make sure the students pass the exams, make sure that your normal distribution falls in line with what the department wants, right? So you might not necessarily be preparing them for standardized testing, although in faculties of education, there still is a lot of standardized testing for principals and other administrators. It's actually really sad that they're one of the major proponents of standardized testing, and they just can't seem to get away from it. But you've got that requirement to simply ensure that the student can demonstrate they've received the information, they can give it back to you, and then you're on to the next content that you need to deliver. And again, there's no emphasis on learning. So, in this past week, we've stumbled across a couple of these articles that talk about the fact that our system of education is killing intrinsic motivation.
Mhm.
And there's a little bit of a connection to the growth mindset that we talked about the other week as well, right? We can talk all we want about intrinsic motivation. We can talk all we want about the growth mindset. But if we aren't creating that environment where the student can grow, if we aren't creating that environment where the student has an opportunity to be motivated, how do you get motivated to pass a test other than, well, you want to do well? But in terms of your life, in terms of your future, in terms of your growth, in terms of learning, that type of motivation is connected to autonomy, mastery, and purpose, as Daniel Pink and other authors have pointed to. Um, I think we've got a systemic problem that we need to resolve. What, what do
Yeah.
you think?
As you were talking, I started thinking about some of the unintended collateral consequences that come with this got to pass the test and what gets measured gets done mentality in our schools. So it's so easy for teachers to dangle the if you pass this test, I'm going to give you this, and that if then sort of reward system. And what that's really doing is I think decreasing that internal motivation, because then what's happening is we're putting emphasis on grades, the carrot and the stick, really, if you will. We're putting emphasis on grades and tests, and we're perpetuating that systemic problem that you're talking about. And as much as I love, some of the schools that I've worked in, I too noticed there was a reward and an extrinsic reward for everything. And if we consistently have an extrinsic reward for everything, it's like a block or hindrance on what intrinsically motivates you, because you're going after that award or reward. When it's done, okay, now what? What's my next reward? And Pink in his book argues that this is how addictive behaviors start. This is how unhealthy behaviors start to take shape. And then this follows us through middle school, high school, and then on up into higher ed. And Pink says very specifically, we encourage this short-term thinking, that carrot and the stick and getting the grade and passing that standardized test at the expense of the long-term view. And we always talk about in our LMDs about shifting, your little UTEP cup, about shifting the focus just a little bit so you can see what's here, but this is where I'm going. So if we continue to perpetuate this issue, we are stamping approval on extrinsic motivation, and that's not actually what's going to help our kids become innovators and grow their passions and learn, which is systemically what part of the problem is that I see. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is sobering. We are perpetuating a system of extrinsic rewards, a system of sorting. It goes back to earlier conversations about, in education, we use the rhetoric of Dewey and Piaget, and we talk about all these wonderful things and engaging learners and personalized learning. But the reality is, we have the system of Thorndike. We sort, we measure, we assess, and to get students to perform, we dangle the carrot,
Mhm.
right? And if they aren't, we don't get good grades. You'll whack them with a stick, right? The grades. So it really, it really is unfortunate. Yeah, it's sobering. Um, what do we do about it? Actually, before we talk about what do we do about it, it isn't just in K to 12 that this problem is coming about, and I think it's a serious issue. I had mentioned before I filled in for somebody and I handled a workshop for an adult education class, and I was working with some folks, and some of these people work in different disciplines, and I was working with people who work in aerospace. So the guys who fix your airplanes, the guys who fix your airplanes, and the attention to detail and the skill and ability, these aren't just mechanics. These are aeronautical mechanical engineers. These are people that have to take their job extremely seriously. And one of the instructors I was working with was lamenting the fact that his whole system in their training program is based on extrinsic rewards. And so much of his discipline is having the personal, professional responsibility to go that extra step to make sure that every single bolt, every single rivet, everything is taken care of because people's lives are at stake. And he said the number one challenge they're facing in preparing future mechanics is that a lot of today's students come into the system and into the process, and they can pass any test you want, but ask them to be a bit more responsible, ask them to take some initiative. If it's not on the test, they're not going to do it. And yet it's those softer skills. It's that work ethic. It's that responsibility. That it's that accountability. It's that ability to work collaboratively. It's that ability to take personal responsibility that is going to make a difference when you have an aeronautical mechanical engineer paying attention to the plane that he is working on because your life depends on it. And there is becoming some serious issues. Just think what airplane was just grounded. Now, there was a design issue, right? There's a software issue, but we often do see mechanical issues, and I think things like this are going to increase. And so it wasn't just this individual. There's other instructors who are lamenting the fact that our students today will pass any test you want. They know how the system works, but don't ask them to do anything else because they're not used to it. So systemically, we are hindering the future of our society. We have to fix it. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on what I just mentioned, and then fixing it? And then we'll shift our focus on how do we fix this problem?
So I think that I remember giving some sort of open-ended assignments whenever I taught, even kindergartners, 5 and 6 year olds. Even before that, they're indoctrinated that there's a certain way to do things. Oh, mom writes a 25-page paper in one day and gets an A. That I'm modeling the best behavior, right? So they're indoctrinated when they hear that language and that talk. So when you give them something a little bit more open-ended, they don't know what to do with it. They question every step along the way. Is this right? Am I doing this right? I'm so worried about my grade, and I hear that a lot. Back when I was teaching even kinder and third grade, and even those grades in between. So just dealing with that indoctrination at that age was like, you know what? It's okay to experiment. It's okay to have fun. It's okay to be creative. You can still meet all of your learning needs and what school is asking you to learn. If you just take it to a level that's authentic and important to you, they can grow their intrinsic motivation that way, right? So I see where that issue is sort of playing out even in the younger years. I sat in on a dissertation just yesterday, and she was doing her defense, and one of her primary themes that emerged from her study was, well, teachers are a little scared to let go of control, let the kids have the iPad and learn how to code and do you know, get the iPad and just play around with some of the coding software that's out there for free. And I that rang in my head, and I said, man, boy, have I heard this argument before, the DLL program. And many teachers, but what we're finding is, guess what, if we want kids to not forfeit their autonomy, and we want them to be contributors to the culture of school, we have to let go of a little bit of that control. We want them to grow their autonomy. We want them to grow their motivation. Isn't that what's preparing them for life? How many tests, Dr. Hrabnik, did you take that prepared you for the life of tests, the test of life?
Well, remember, I was a high school dropout, so testing really wasn't my thing. And then, when I did higher ed, I did the humanities. Not a lot of tests in humanities, so more paper writing. So, yeah, no, testing really is something that I never did well at. Although, as a younger child, because I read a lot, testing was easy. Actually, I learned very quickly. You can just reason your way through most tests, and it was okay. And just as long as you didn't fail, it was okay. So no, testing didn't prepare me for life in any way, shape, or form. So you're talking about control, which I think is an extremely important factor, and this is us switching into the solution to the problem. So the same article that pointed out about the problem of schools quashing or killing intrinsic motivation pointed to the solution, but it's not easy. It's not an easy solution, and it's exactly what you said. You have to give the learner the opportunity. You have to create the type of a learning environment, a significant learning environment, where the learner has a little bit control over their learning. Where have we heard that before? So ideally, you want to create these projects that the learner then can, make their own. Or ideally, if you can, you let the learner choose a projects. Interesting. So you create this learning environment. This is what the article is saying. So you have to create a really different environment that will allow the learner as much choice as possible. And if they can do real learning assignments, well, then they'll take that ownership, and then you don't have to worry about intrinsic motivation. It just happens. Guess what? Create a significant learning environment, give your learner choice, ownership, and voice through those authentic learning opportunities, and it works. Now, the article said, but it's not easy because we have a system that is based on control, command and control. And you mentioned about your dissertation experience, observation yesterday. Yeah, oh, if the kids are playing with the iPad, I'm going to lose control. That's learning. That's learning. That's part of the learning process. And so if you shift the focus off of you being the control agent to you being the coach, the guide, the mentor, you being the facilitator of learning, well, then it's a matter of managed chaos. Learning is managed chaos. And that's okay. We've got to get back to this notion that there is going to be a certain amount of the unknown, and things are going to happen, and kids are going to be kids, or learners are going to be learners, because they're learning and making mistakes, errors, error correction, ups, downs, the excitement, the disappointments. That's learning. I'm going to make a little switch here to giving a real world example. I'm using my boys as I always do. My younger son is just about to sign a contract. He started a brand new business in January. In the past 4 months, it's grown, and he's moving from his little tiny shop to a larger commercial space. He's going to be taking that on starting next month. And he's excited. It's amazing. It's wonderful. And he's got all these projects lined up. And he says, but Dad, man, it's going to cost like $2,000 a month for this space. How am I going to afford that? That's a lot of money. You know how much work I have to do to pay. He's excited about this. But he's worried. But at the same time, he says, yeah, but you know what? I've got all this work lined up, and it's going to work out. Yeah, I'm going to make it work. Yeah, it'll be okay. Well, guess what? That's learning to deal with business. That's learning to deal with life. And you know what? Those ups and downs, when he was a young kid, he used to get so frustrated. I remember when he was changing the pickups on one of his brand new guitars. He bought a guitar. He wanted to pay a little bit less for a guitar, and he could have got the same guitar with the certain pickups, but he wanted to install them himself because he thought he could do a better job. Man, did he have one frustrating Sunday afternoon. Well, the the holes weren't big enough. We had to get the Dremel tool out. We're talking trial and error and frustration. At one point, oh, Dad, why didn't you just tell me not to do this? You could have saved me so much time, Dad. And they said, but you know what, Dad, I'm glad you didn't because I have to learn how to do this. So here's a young kid. I think he was 13 or 14 when he was going through that frustration, recognizing he had to do this. Yeah, Dad, I had to do this. Right. My older son, I've talked about examples. When he was taking care of one of our friends, house sitting for one of our friends, and taking care of these full size dogs, and man, those dogs kept him busy, and he was walking them, and you add that to his busy day of training, and man, I knew how much work was going to be involved. And I remember asking him, well, Levi, should I have told you that, all that work was going to cut into your training? I remember him looking over at me. He goes, Dad, I wouldn't have listened. I had to learn that one myself. That's learning. If
Mhm.
you let go of the control
Yeah.
and let your learner learn, they'll learn. And then that that intrinsic motivation, that autonomy, by giving them the autonomy, they will recognize that they can have mastery. And when that's aligned with their purpose, you're preparing them for life. And the sky's the limit. Then you turn them into schemers and your learners into schemers and dreamers who are going to approach life with this attitude. "Hmm, how hard could that be?" So instead of, oh, am I going to pass a test, to, how hard could that be? That's where we want to go. That's where we want to take the learners. So systemically, what are we advocating? A simple shift. Let's shift from focusing on delivering content to focus a little bit higher. Look at those big, authentic learning opportunities as a chance to provide your learner choice, ownership, and voice that will lead to their autonomy, their
Mhm.
mastery, and their purpose. The fix has always been available. And the hardest part for us as teachers, let go. That's the tough part, though, right? Letting go. What do you think?
Oh, so many things going through my mind. I think first about the role of a coach. So, do we want our kids to be purposefully engaged in a sports event? Do we want them to, make some decisions and learn, or do we want to have a coaching situation? And I'm talking about, like, thinking of a t-ball game or soccer. Do we want the coach to tell the kids exactly what to do, step by step by step by step, so that they come back and say, now what? What do I do now? I can't think. Uh-oh, the ball went. You said the ball was going to go this way, but it actually went this way. I'm frozen. What do I do? And then, so if we have coaches and teachers who are controlling every step of what learning is supposed to look like, kids don't ever actually get an opportunity to, go a different way, go down their path. We're not saying that, prepping them for tests and learning the knowledge and skills and competencies are wrong. We're not saying that. What we are saying is we have to give our kids a little bit of an injection of what it feels like to be their own autonomous learner. Do we want them to be self-directed? Do we want to give them ownership of what they're doing? Do we want them to be motivated, and we want to give them have them purposely engaged in what they're learning? Then we have to let go a little bit and give them a little space to learn. Because if we've done our job well, kids will be willing to take risks, try new things, innovate, and have some pathway moving forward. But if we're caught in I've got to tell you every step one, step two, step three, step four, and that kind of goes back into the information transfer model. And you can't use an iPad unless I have full control. Then me as a teacher, I own everything that's going on there, and the kids don't even get an opportunity to embrace learning and and what it could be. So then I've schooled them as opposed to giving them an opportunity to learn. And that's where I think we have to be really careful. I would go back and do a lot of things differently, knowing what I know now based on my own mistakes, right? And that's part of learning, right? And I wouldn't get you could tell me this all you want, but until I see it and hear it and learn it for myself, sometimes it doesn't click. But if I'm not given the opportunity to really investigate, try things, make mistakes, I don't see things. If everything's controlled in my environment, I may not gain the perspective that I have now, right? So I'm kind of dipping back into the educator's role here because that's where my brain goes. step back a little bit, see what happens, give your kids opportunities to solve problems the way that they would, select a tool that they want to use to solve that issue or that problem, pose an open-ended question, see what kinds of responses you get, tweak it, try it, just give it a whirl and see how engaged the students become. If you start seeing a spark, the motivation will go with that. Guess what? You want your kids to start working on real world problems and solve issues. Give them a little chance to have that space to do that. And you might be thinking, oh, I can't fit all this in my day as an educator. Start slow, start small, take steps in that direction, start tweaking very slightly what you're doing. Or maybe if something is a controlled question, open it up, allow divergent answers. Just tweak it just a little bit. It doesn't have to be every day all the time. Sometimes my students coming into the first course in the program will say, how do I inject COVA in every lesson? Well, you don't actually do that. You immerse them within the learning environment and tweak little things one step at a time when you can. You do have to teach grammar. You do have to teach, subject verb agreement. Those things, yes, we do need to know those things. But there's a way that we can take some of those little skills and things and open it up. Write a story. Tell me something. Go make something. Why not? Why can't we turn every day into fun learning, creative learning?
You've made me think of something that is important and something I haven't said for a little while. In my early days, I used to make an argument that an effective learning environment was structured for openness. Some people, what do you mean structured for openness? How can it be structured for openness? Well, actually, it is, because you can build a structure and you can build parameters and guidelines and boundaries. And within those boundaries, there's openness and flexibility and adaptability. And
Mhm.
so what you've identified is really important. And not just yourself, but this article also pointed to the fact that while this is hard to move down this path, the hardest part is letting go of control. But it also, and we should be encouraged by this, once you start to give the learner that ownership back and they take hold of it, then as an educator, you see how much motivation they do have
Yep.
and how much drive that they will take on. And then it's a matter of giving them enough support and resources as they're racing towards their goals. And
Mhm.
so, I mentioned that, yeah, learning is about controlled chaos. Well, it is in one sense, but I don't want to scare people. It's controlled chaos within the parameters of a structure, right? The structure never goes away. So when people hear this, don't make the assumption that we're advocating that you do away with school. This is
Yeah.
unschool. No, no. As you said, you make some tweaks. You take a look at opening up the structure of your questions. You start to look at ways that you can let go and give the learning back to the learner. You talked about those steps, right? Here's an exercise that I think can be very sobering for a lot of people. And I did this when my kids were young, and I've done this in some workshops. If you have people write down step-by-step instructions how to get out of the room in the quickest, easiest possible way, most people will spend quite a few minutes stuck at their desk because they overlook all these individual steps, because there's always a lot of assumptions that are going on. So when they write down step-by-step instructions to get out of the room, and then you ask them to do it, they'll find out that they missed something, they missed something, they missed something, right? So it doesn't take long to point out to educators that if we ask our students to develop a reliance on our step-by-step instruction, if we miss a step, we're going to mess them up. Really quick example, teaching my boys how to drive when they were young. I went through a bit of a step, tried not to. Well, in something like that, you have to. I told Levi to, turn on the key. Great, no problem. And then, then you make sure it's in neutral. Well, when he went to turn on the key, I didn't tell him to let go of the key. Guess what? Right? I said, "Oh, Levi, let go, let go." And he looks over at me. Man, you're a teacher, you know. ah. But that was a classic. He joked, right? But that's a classic example that if we miss a certain step, and we can never do as good a job with those step-by-step instructions if we get students to completely solely rely on that, right? So as you were saying, you start to move away from that in some areas. You insert those projects, right? You start to let them choose a project. You make a connection between the project and the real world. Maybe instead of just building a community garden, well, what about bringing in, maybe there's a seniors lodge across the street. Maybe you get some of the seniors to come and share their experience. And then you work with, looking at the history of your community through the seniors. So maybe this community garden turns into a service project that could connect your elementary school with seniors. And what's the best way to have seniors engage with kids? They can read to them when they're small. There's a myriad of opportunities that you can connect to the real world and make learning authentic. And it's just a matter of being open to letting go and moving in that direction. Now, one last thing that you mentioned is really important. So sometimes our students say, how do I actually apply COVA? Yeah, okay, if you're talking about applying COVA, you're missing the idea. You don't apply it. You create an environment where you give the learner choice, ownership, and voice through authentic learning opportunities. It's the authentic learning opportunities that allow COVA to happen. So if you're thinking of administering COVA as an approach, or not approach, as more of an intervention, well, then you've missed the whole perspective. It's not. You're creating the environment where this happens. And this is a real, genuine problem. Over the years, I've taught a lot of teachers, because we have built a system of education where it's competency based, and we look at breaking down those skills, and everything is broken down into those steps, and you test all those different steps. We've stopped thinking about that bigger picture, and we simply look at learning, or not learning, but we look at our system of education as a process of information content delivery. And it's the delivery of learning, the delivery of education. I just cringe when I hear, alternate delivery, or delivery of learning. Ugh, you're not delivering learning, you're delivering content, to be honest. Right. So that's the challenge. So we can make those little shifts, but it has to begin with the educator recognizing that you're not going to harm the learner by giving them some responsibility and accountability and ownership. If anything, you're going to stimulate that intrinsic motivation. And you can tell them as much as you want about the growth mindset. You can give them amazing, wonderful videos that will motivate them and excite them. But if your system is still designed in such a way that it's limiting their growth mindset, if it's limiting motivation by taking away their autonomy, by taking away the ability for them to master something, if it's taking away their purpose, well, guess what? You've just taken away their intrinsic motivation as well. So we have control over our classrooms. We have control over that aspect of the system, and we can make those little changes. Remember, it's just a shift of focus. Look up to the real world project, right? I'll bring up the old UTEP cup, right? So instead of looking at that, shift it back a little bit. Look at the bigger picture. Oh yeah, there's the logo. Sometimes it's that little shift to begin with that can make the difference. And that's what the article said. The article also was honest. It's not easy because the system is stacked against you.
Mhm.
Guess what? Valuable stuff in life often isn't easy. That's what makes it valuable. I think we have no choice but to go there. And any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
Um, I saw a Twitter post last week. One of our former students, Rhoda Hahn, and her students were working on some authentic learning project. I'm not exactly sure what it was because I didn't see the full context. But her quick tweet was, "No grades assigned, just learning." And that was it. And for some reason, that's played back in my head several times. And I started thinking, gosh, reminded me of something Pink said in his book about the more we grade creative kinds of work, sometimes the less creative and the less motivated our kids will be and do. So we have to give them those opportunities to explore and have fun and give them opportunities to make choices. So I started thinking too, one other thing here about the step-by-step directions on how to get to the door. Sure, I can come up with a list of step-by-step directions on how to best get through the room and get out the door, as you were talking about earlier. But Dr. H, you're going to come up with totally different directions on how to get there. This person's going to come up with Rhoda's going to come up with a totally different way of how to get there. why not give those kids those opportunities when they're there? If we're going to teach them, step by step directions, how to do something, let them come up with their step by step way to do something. Their problem, they're going to solve a problem in a unique way. That's how easy we can shift some things. So what when you took your son and taught him how to drive, and dad, you forgot to take your hand off the key, maybe his step-by-step directions will be a little bit different than the ones you created, right? And that's a way we can just very easily shift our focus without changing everything that we're doing. It's really that easy. We hold the power as educators to mold and shape how that environment looks, so that our kids can have opportunities to make choices, fail forward, to take ownership and build autonomy and agency over what they're doing, to give them a voice when things don't work. Dad, you forgot to tell me to. We give them a voice and how that how their path and their steps forward. And all of this can be seen and realized if we as the educator just shift our focus ever so slightly and grow into cultivating that significant learning environment. One small step at a time is all it really takes. Not a complete transformation or shift and take everything down in your classroom and restart. A simple shift. Look at the questions you're asking your kids and the inquiry, some of the things you're doing with them. Look at them again. Look at, how can I rephrase this so that my kids can take ownership of this? How can I make this a little more open-ended so they can come up with a creative answer? Little shifts. That's the key thing I think I want to end this with on my end is we're not asking you to transform everything you're doing. We're asking you to take a deeper look at what you're doing, and are you setting up the conditions and the context where students can be thoughtfully engaged, can take autonomy, gain the mastery that they need, and have that purposeful engagement to really build their intrinsic motivation and become learners for life, not learners for a test.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Again, I just want to reiterate, it's that shift of focus, right? Just looking up to the authentic learning opportunity, and then all those other ideas fit into that context. It's really changing the context. When you're talking about, the step-by-step instructions are going to be different for different people. It's also different where the person is sitting in the room, the context, right? Where the learner is at goes back to the learner, right? It is about the learning, right? So, yeah, I think we've dealt with this quite well. I know I'm motivated to encourage my next class to look at these things in a wonderful way and to share these resources with them. So, on that note, I think we should say adieu and say until next time.
Okay.
Take care.